Okay, the next item of business is a debate on behalf of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee, a debate on committee effectiveness inquiry. I'd invite members wishing to participate in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Martin Whitfield to speak on behalf of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. Around 7 minutes, Mr Whitfield. I'm
very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer, and it's a pleasure to open this debate this afternoon and to see so many people eager to contribute to what is, in essence, an evidence-capturing session for what I modestly think is probably one of the most important inquiries any committee will undertake during this session. So let us go back. Let's turn the clock back to 1774 and to listen to the words of Edmund Burke, who was trying to explain to his electorate some of the challenges that he faced, and indeed the relationship between elected representatives and their constituents. His reflection was that government and legislation are matters of reason and judgment, and not of inclination. And what sort of reason is that in which the determination precedes discussion? If I can be so bold as to take these words and look at them as how we challenge scrutiny, how should we, as modern-day parliamentarians, set aside our individual, our party viewpoint, but to focus on delivering the best scrutiny we can in the interests of our constituents? Or how do we develop a culture, to quote a fellow MSP, of being prepared to open and to accept that you might hear evidence over the course of a process that leads you to change your view? As I open this debate on the Standards, Procedure and Public Appointments Committee inquiry on committee effectiveness, I'm keen to make clear that today is about hearing views, reflections, experiences of members of this chamber on the important matter. As a committee, we do not hold a monopoly of wisdom on committee effectiveness, and I wish to ensure that today, whether members' reflections be informed by their role as a committee member, indeed as a convener, or indeed as a minister, that they have a chance for them to be aired, to be shared, discussed in a constructive and open debate. We have had three strands to our work: structure, elected conveners and evaluation. Today's debate is the final part of our evidence gathering. We have held 5 oral evidence sessions, captured both practice, academic expertise on committee operation. We've held a facilitated discussion with the conveners group, gathered written views from the public, from other legislatures, parties and indeed committees. So we are primed to feed what we as the committee hear from you today into our work, and ultimately our inquiry conclusions and recommendations back to this chamber. And can I thank all of those who've engaged up to this date with our work. The evidence we've received highlights where committees are performing well. They carry out important, if sometimes unsung, work. They have impact. They do hold the Scottish Government to account and achieve good outcomes. They provide an opportunity for we to hear directly from those who are impacted by the decisions that we take.
Stephen Kerr.
Grateful to Martin Whitfield for giving way. Would he agree with me? Just looking around this chamber, I can see conveners of committees who have established powerful committees on the basis that he's describing. How important is the role of the convener? Would he agree with me that the convener sets the culture and tone for the committee and allows the committee to do exactly what he is suggesting should be the role of the committee?
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful for the intervention, and of course the convener holds a key piece of that jigsaw in ensuring that the committee works effectively. And I'll come to that piece of evidence in a minute. If the member would just kindly let me finish the impact of our work. Because to aid today's deliberations, Deputy Presiding Officer, if I may, I'd like to set out in detail some of the strands that we've looked at. In relation to structure, we have been seeking to answer the question of whether there are structural and procedural changes which would improve committee scrutiny. We've heard about the size of a committee and whether that does or indeed does not matter. Smaller committees seem to assist with a sense of cohesion, but a bigger committee offers flexibility to deploy committee members as reporters, to form subcommittees, to manage higher workloads. We've looked at the churn in the membership, and this has been a recurring theme, as well as consideration of ways to reduce that churn. Reflections on how its impact can be mitigated by committees having a mission statement setting out long-term aims and purpose so that new members can recognise and support those from the outset. Consideration of committee remits into relation of whether they should continue to mirror the ministerial portfolios, or whether indeed there needs to be more flexibility for ad hoc bill committees, more cross-committee working. There's been reflections on what is seen by many to be the ideal of a committee member leaving their party hat at the committee door. Whether this is actually always desirable or indeed realistic to achieve, and how members can be empowered in their role through induction, training and support to achieve that. There's also been exploration on the use of parliamentary time and if this should be utilised differently, with specific periods set aside to focus on committee activity or more flexibility for committees to meet in private session at the same time as the Chamber does. We've agreed as a committee that as a minimum, from the start of next session, there should be no single-sex committees. And we've used this inquiry to explore the other quotas set out in the gender-sensitive audit regarding committee membership and convenership. The second strand, to answer the intervention, was in relation to elected conveners.
Acting Carlo.
I hear the statement that there should be no single-sex committees in the Parliament. Can he tell us how he would ensure that would be delivered?
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful for the intervention, and of course that challenge will rest with the members of this chamber in the new session. But we highlight it because of the overwhelming evidence that we've heard that just having no single-sex committees is one step in achieving a better gender balance. But the reality is we have to face, or those who come will have to face, how the chamber is made up and the different characteristics of those. So on one side, it is a bellow from this side of a dark tunnel that comes out at the other side of the election. But we do so from a position of genuine recognition that it will improve the process if that is adhered to. To return to elected conveners, we've had the reflections on the experience from both Westminster and indeed the Senate of moving to elected chairs, a suggestion that elections give chairs, and this speaks to the intervention, more authority, a mandate to run the committee with more independence from party groups. We've also explored whether or not having elected conveners would in fact deliver an alternative career path for members outside of those of government. And I will take the intervention from Jackie Dunbar.
Jackie Dunbar.
I thank the member for taking the intervention. If I can just go back to what you were saying about having the gender balance in committees. But surely that would be down to what the gender balance is going to be like in chamber. Because as it stands just now, if that was to be put in place, what you'd actually be doing is giving us women more work to do because there's more men in this chamber than there are women.
Always through the chair, Martin Whitfield.
I absolutely thank the member for that intervention, and that speaks to the very heart of the reality of what the next session needs to find itself in. And there has been a lot of discussion about where and how that responsibility rests. And much of it rests with political parties in the decisions on how they put forward candidates to go forward, outside the scope and control, rightly outside the scope and control of this chamber. So, to go back to my response to the previous intervention, this is a cry from this side of that dark tunnel to say you will have better committees if they are not single-sex committees. How that is achieved in that wonderful thing of kicking things into the future may rest in implementation with others. I am conscious of time, Deputy Presiding Officer, so I wish to just turn to evaluation, which has been a key aspect that has run through our inquiry. Do committees have time to look at how well they have worked? Do committees have time outside of their legislative programme to explore what they want to do? And we've given consideration to the merit of post-legislative scrutiny as well as a suggestion of added value being given to pre-legislative scrutiny. I hope this short opening has been helpful to members because this is very much a listening exercise by the committee to feed into that. And I look forward to hearing all of the reflections from members across this chamber on what is really, and I reiterate this, a very important committee for those that will come, inquiry for those that will come after us. I'm grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Whitfield. Just to advise the Chamber, we've got a bit of time in hand, so members will get the time back should they be taking interventions. I call next Kenneth Gibson to speak on behalf of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. Around 5 minutes, Mr Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to speak in today's debate on committee effectiveness. It's crucial that the Parliament's practices are kept under review and we continuously improve in order to carry out the most effective scrutiny possible and meet the public's expectations. I therefore welcome the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointment Committee's inquiry into committee effectiveness and the excellent work it has undertaken to date. The SPPA Committee asked me to discuss the approach and practices of the Finance and Public Administration Committee, as we've been mentioned as an example of good practice in the evidence gathered to date. The FPA Committee, since the start of this Parliament, has worked in a consensual, constructive and collective way to hold government to account and to do so robustly where needed. Party politics is largely left at the door, which ensures our work is more impactful. For example, we've published 40 reports so far this session and every single recommendation made has been agreed consensually. Not one has involved a division. Our 7 members represent 4 political parties and 1 member is an independent. Point? Yes, happy to do so.
Thank you. On that note, would you say that it's an advantage having only the 7, which I personally think it is? And also, would you mention the fact that members have to read all the papers because we don't get given spice questions?
Kenneth Gibson.
But actually, John, because I am going to actually touch on that as we progress through this speech. So, pointing to successes, we have as a committee improved the transparency of budgetary information published by the Scottish Government, created the conditions for an open debate around the need for commissioners, or not as the case may be, secured a full review of the National Performance Framework, sought to protect and enhance the time available for parliamentary scrutiny of the Scottish budget, achieved much needed improvements to the consistency and presentation of financial memoranda. I note that one area the SPPA Committee is looking into is the current committee structure, optimal size of membership and the number of committees. And I believe the size of our committee is exactly right. Our workload is a mix of referred items such as pre-budget and budget scrutiny, bills and SSIs. We also undertake 1 or 2 self-initiated inquiries a year. It's crucial all committees do have balanced workloads, and in carrying out our own inquiries, we've chosen subjects where we feel we can make the most impact and effect real change. Our remit this session broadened our scope to do just that, and it's the first time that public administration has been specifically included in a Scottish Parliamentary Committee's responsibilities. That allows us to shine a light on new issues such as the effectiveness of Scottish Government decision-making and embed public administration into all areas of our work, including budget scrutiny and commissioner landscape, cost-effectiveness of public inquiries and the Government's public service reform programme. Indeed.
Stephen Kerr.
Grateful to the member for Goodway, because he is undoubtedly, and I've said this to him privately, I'm going to say it publicly, he is an excellent example of what a convener should be in this Parliament. And he mentions the size of the committee, but can I ask him, given the size of the Parliament, and is there not an issue with the size of the government? I mean, there are nearly 30 ministers, and that does mean if you're in the government party, then your workload in committee terms is going to be that much greater. Shouldn't we be looking at also reducing the size of the number of ministers in the Scottish Government?
Kenneth Gibson.
First of all, you make me blush with that compliment, but secondly, I actually do think you've got a point. I mean, I realise that the remit of the Scottish the remit of the Scottish Government has increased over the years, but in 2007 there were 6 members of the Cabinet and 16 ministers, and we know for a fact that it's increased considerably since. And then let's put a workload on colleagues who, for example, have to cover 2 or more committees. But our committee seeks to continuously identify where improvements can be made to parliamentary scrutiny, including through our current inquiry into the budget process and focus work aimed at strengthening the content of the Government's medium-term financial strategy. It's helped maintain our collective approach that the churn of committee members has been low. 5 remain in place since the early days of this parliamentary session. That makes a huge difference, enabling members to build up expertise, pursue issues over a period of time and identify linkages between the range of topics across our remit. We also pursue lines of questioning until we get answers, even over months or longer. As members know only too well, Committees take different approaches to questioning witnesses. Since the start of the session, as happened indeed when I chaired the 2011 to 2016 Finance Committee, the FPA Committee agreed it didn't want Spice or her clerks to provide pre-scripted questions that would be divided amongst members. Instead, we have background briefings and summaries of evidence to help prompt our own questioning. These are always published for openness and transparency. Again, this sink-or-swim approach encourages members. If I can get my time back, I'm more than happy to take another intervention.
Finlay Carson.
Thank you very much for taking that intervention. There is sometimes calls for some of the less popular aspects within a bill or scrutiny to be covered. It's really important. So there is certainly within the committee that I convene a need for some questions to be asked that might not result in a clip, or might not result in the member pursuing their own aspects of the bill that they're interested in, but it doesn't exclude the fact that these areas need to be covered.
Kenneth Gibson.
Well, what usually happens in Finance Committee, just to digress slightly, is that I tend to open and cover a number of topics, which are then followed by members exploring them in greater depth. But we don't discuss as a committee what we're going to explore. It's up to every individual member to do that. And I find that everything is covered in about 80 to 90% of the time. If anything isn't, if there's one or two items that are left out, then I tend to cover that at the end, and always ask witnesses if they have any further points they wish to make. But as I was saying, Presiding Officer, this sink-or-swim approach encourages members to develop their own knowledge and pursue particular areas of interest, leading to effective and impactful scrutiny and members feeling invested in the committee's work. Finally, Presiding Officer, I wanted to emphasise the importance of the convener setting the tone for consensual and impactful scrutiny, as Stephen Kerr emphasised in his earlier intervention on Martin Whitfield. Leadership is important. Being from the government party, I've worked hard to gain the trust of and build solid relationships with committee members from across the political divide, and I'm sure they would agree I've never shied away from asking difficult questions of government and other witnesses. I allow members the space and time to pursue their own lines of questioning and create opportunities to work together at business planning days and fact-finding visits, and I seek to consult members and represent the collective view prior to meeting with ministers and stakeholders and when speaking to the media on the committee's behalf. Presiding Officer, I understand that the SPPA committee is considering whether elected conveners would strengthen the committees of the Parliament, and if so, how. That's not an issue the FPA committee has considered, but it's clear to me that conveners of all parties can already play a key role in strengthening the effectiveness of their committees. However, they must be prepared to set the tone for all members to work in a constructive, non-partisan way and ensure the necessary processes and practices are in place to support impactful scrutiny. I look forward to hearing other contributions in this debate. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Gibson. I now call on Richard Leonard on behalf of the Public Audit Committee. Again, around 5 minutes. Mr Leonard.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Predominantly on behalf of the Public Audit Committee. The Public Audit Committee has submitted a formal response to the SPPA in its inquiry, but I wanted to take a few minutes to speak about the experience the Public Audit Committee brings, because it does have a particular remit. It does have a distinctive structure. It does have a different way of working compared to most other committees in this Parliament. And let me begin by saying that our committee is smaller than most committees in the Parliament, with just 5 members. But we've found that not to be a weakness, it's proved to be a strength, because it gives every member the space to contribute properly every week. It creates the time for more in-depth questioning of witnesses, and it helps build trust and collaboration across party lines, something that is especially important in scrutiny work. With fewer voices in the room, we're easier able to follow the evidence, and it allows committee members not just to ask a question, but to ask a second question, a third, even a fourth follow-up question of the same witness. So it leads to more thorough scrutiny and a more constructive tone. And that's why we've said in our written submission that smaller, more focused committees could improve scrutiny right across the Parliament. I'll take an intervention from Mr
John Mason.
I thank the member for taking the intervention. And as you'll gather, I'm also a fan of smaller committees. But how do we tie that in with the party representation? Because some of the more popular committees, unlike his, are like, say, education. Everybody wants to be on it.
Richard Leonard.
Well, I'm simply observing. Mr Mason and I, in the last session, were both on the Economy Committee, and Ash Regan was on that. It was quite a large committee, and I have to say, in the end, on quite a lot of reports, it broke down into tribalism, and people voted along party lines. My experience on other committees that session and on the Public Audit Committee this session is that there tends to be much better cross-party working. And I think that is in part, not exclusively, but in part a function of the size of the committee. Let me turn to something else. Yes, I'll take an intervention.
I'm grateful to Richard Leonard for giving way. But doesn't this highlight the fact that the role of member of the Scottish Parliament should transcend the party labels with which we're elected? And shouldn't we often just junk the haunt? Shouldn't it be the best possible people to do the job on behalf of the people of Scotland? Shouldn't that be the criteria for the committee work, for anything that we do as a parliament?
Richard Leonard.
Well, I'm going to come along. I'm going to come on to discuss some of that at the end of my contribution. So I will hopefully answer Mr Kerr's question with my perspective on that. But let me turn to something which has already come up and which I think is an issue, and that is low turnover in committee membership is, in my view, better for nurturing collective and a consistent approach. Expertise, building relationships take time, but the experience that we've had in public audit is that, in fact, there are only 2 of us who are the original members from the start of the session. And this is not a criticism, it's simply an observation. And for the record, it's not because of the unpopularity of the Public Audit Committee, Mr Mason. For the record as well, it's not because those who have left have done so to take up ministerial posts. That might be a criticism, actually. But Parliament may wish, in my view, to consider the benefits of locking in stable committee membership as much as possible. Our committee also works differently in another significant way. Unlike most other committees, we do not routinely take evidence from ministers. Instead, we hear principally from senior civil servants, the so-called accountable officers, from the Scottish Government and from public bodies, defined incidentally in the Scottish Public Finance Manual as accountable officers whose accountability is to us, to Parliament, on behalf of the people, not to government. So these are the people with direct responsibility for how public money is spent and how public services are delivered. That allows us, in turn, to ask questions about performance, questions about outcomes, about value for money, without party politics dominating the room. And it helps us focus as well on the evidence, on whether service users, whether citizens are getting what they've been promised. And that approach has been central to some of our most high-profile work, once again this week on the delays and escalating costs of the Glen Sannox and Glen Rosa ferries programme, and then again just last week with the publication of our report on the misuse of public money by the Water Industry Commission for Scotland. On the question of elected conveners, our committee members held differing views, and we've submitted those individually. But on gender balance, we were united. We support an end to single-sex committees. We would welcome positive action to ensure a better gender balance exists across all of this Parliament's committees. But we also believe this is about more than gender. We believe that diversity of background, of experience and of perspective strengthens parliamentary scrutiny, because the people who hold those in power to account should better reflect the people we are elected to serve. So, some final thoughts from me, Deputy Presiding Officer. We have duties which we must discharge as representatives. I'm elected on a party ticket. Of course I am. I would not be a member of this Parliament had I not been a Labour candidate. But we were not elected to be robots, trembling before the party whips. Ultimately, we are responsible to ourselves, to our consciences, to our values. And that, in my view, should be better reflected in the way we conduct ourselves in committee and in this chamber. We are not managers or would-be managers. We are elected representatives. We should have conviction in our politics and the courage of our conviction. These are questions not just about the future of this Parliament. These are not just operational matters. They are about the state of our democracy itself. History tells us that progress comes from below, that parliaments have to catch up. And I hope that this Parliament does catch up with the people's hunger for more active, popular democracy, not just in our Parliament, not just in our politics, but the hunger for more active, popular democracy in our economy as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Leonard. I now call on Audrey Nicholl on behalf of the Criminal Justice Committee. Again, around 5 minutes. Ms. Nicholl.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And it's also a pleasure to speak in this debate this afternoon to give some personal reflections on committee effectiveness in my role as convener of the Criminal Justice Committee. And I pay tribute to the work of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee for securing this debate following their very important and interesting inquiry. And I also want to thank all of those who are or have been members of the Criminal Justice Committee during my time as convener. I believe that we have demonstrated what an effective committee looks like. Presiding Officer, without being immodest, I think the Criminal Justice Committee has worked hard to secure its reputation for robust scrutiny, whether in committee-led inquiries or when scrutinising legislation that comes under our remit. My goodness, there has been a lot of legislation. And just on the point of pre-prepared questions that some members have already raised this afternoon, my view, certainly within the context of criminal justice, is that there certainly is a need for some pre-prepared questions, and that's to help ensure that all aspects of a bill's provision are the subject of evidence that is taken during committee scrutiny. But I do consider that it is important to extend some flexibility to members who may be interested in following their own line of questioning. I'll take your intervention.
Liz Smith.
Grateful to Audrey Nicholl for taking the intervention, and I agree with the point she just made. Nonetheless, does she accept that if there are pre-prepared questions, there is a temptation for some members not to do the homework that is required in able to do some thinking for yourself and to weed out what are the most important points? Because if it's there for you, the temptation is it's all done. Would you accept that?
Audrey Nicholl.
Thank Liz Smith for her intervention, and I agree. I absolutely agree, and I think it is just the responsibility of all members to consider their own lines of questioning. But also, as I say, I think one of the advantages of pre-prepared questioning is just to ensure that we do take evidence across a broad spectrum of the provisions, particularly when it comes to scrutinising bills. So I've always taken the view that even as a member of the party of government, I see our committee as a critical friend of the government, not frightened to criticise when improvements are needed, but constructively so, in order to work with ministers and others on as much of a shared agenda as we could across the parties. And I think our record as a committee demonstrates this, and that is in no small part to all parties on the committee being prepared, most of the time, to set aside party politics and try to obtain real change, whether through our scrutiny of, for example, the Victims, Witnesses and Justice Reform Bill that will potentially make fundamental changes to our justice system, or improving the way police officers are supported in their mental well-being, or supporting calls to end Friday releases from prison. And as convener, I've been keen that our committee is one that, where possible, seeks consensus across political parties and, regardless of political affiliation, considers matters in a fair way with a focus on improving Scotland's criminal justice system. And I believe that we have done that. So in addition to working collaboratively, I believe effective committees are ones that have excellent relationships and dialogue with stakeholders and individuals in their remit and are responsive to tackling the concerns that they bring to us. So, being fleet of foot and creative, the committee has always been willing to find a way to make progress on an issue, listening to, considering evidence and, where appropriate, encouraging ministers to take action. And I cannot talk about our work programme without commending our clerking team, without whom I would certainly be lost. Nothing is too much trouble, and the huge workload that the team carries to make our committee work so well is not lost on any of us. The support we receive from Spice Communications and PACT colleagues is second to none, and we are indebted to them all for their support. And I think it's worth noting the sensitivity of some of our committee's work that has involved us taking evidence from some highly vulnerable and complex witnesses, and the complex and detailed support that is provided by the PACT team to make those evidence sessions happen, to ensure that we get the best evidence from all our witnesses. So, Presiding Officer, this session the Criminal Justice Committee has seen relatively few membership changes, and this continuity of members, and indeed clerks and researchers, has meant that we have built up a really good understanding of the remit and what needs to be done. And I think this was a point that was very well articulated by Richard Leonard earlier. And we've also been innovative in our work, working with two other committees to scrutinise the Scottish Government response to tackling drug harm and reducing drugs deaths, and supporting the work of the Scottish Government National Mission. And this cross-committee work also supported a People's Panel process that brought together members of the public to consider what Scotland should do differently to reduce drugs deaths. So, Presiding Officer, let me conclude now by saying I firmly believe our committees are at their most effective when we're working collectively, without fear or favour to the government, being creative in our work and persistent in achieving real change within our remit. Convening a committee is an utter privilege, not without its pressures and demands, but made so much easier by the support of all members. And for that support, I extend my grateful thanks.
Thank you. Now call on Jamie Hepburn, Minister, around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, President Officer. Can I begin by thanking the committee for their work on this area as well? This Parliament, of course, recently celebrated its 25th anniversary, and as Kenny Gibson set out, it is, of course, right that how Parliament operates is constantly kept under review to ensure the best ways of working can be identified and implemented where there is consensus to do so. I begin with an observation. A few weeks ago, we had the debate in Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee on framework bills and Henry VIII powers. The convener then was able to cite the Donmore report of 1932. Today, the convener of the SPPA has been able to go further back in the annals of history to 1774 to cite Edmund Burke. I note that today Mr Carlaw's committee has published its blueprint for participation. We'll debate that shortly, so there is a challenge to Mr Carlaw in terms of how far back in history he can go in opening that debate. President Officer, I speak today in my ministerial capacity, so given the importance of protecting the principle of ministers being accountable to Parliament, I'm sure colleagues will understand my desire to avoid being seen to direct how Parliament discharges its responsibility. Instead, my principal interest is in considering how any changes might impact on delivery of government business. At the outset, I want to acknowledge the careful way in which the committee is going about its inquiry and its desire, as evidenced by this debate today, in a different format from those that we normally hold, to ensure a wide range of perspectives are taken into account. I also want to recognise the difficult challenge that the committee has set for itself by tackling the issue of committee effectiveness. Whether or not something is effective might not be an easy thing to reach a view on, and I know that from research the committee has commissioned that many parliaments have had difficulties in identifying outputs and measures on effectiveness. It is, of course, not for me, President Officer, to say how effective parliamentary committees are at holding government to account, but I can perhaps just draw attention to how subjective and varied effectiveness can be. If we are to take the example of bills, how should we measure effectiveness. Is effectiveness best measured by how much impact a committee has on a bill, by making amendments? And the attraction with that metric, of course, is that it has the benefit being something tangible and measurable. Or is it more about how the committee has gone about the scrutiny of that bill in terms of investigating its purpose, whether it will deliver on that purpose, whether there are alternatives, what stakeholders think, and so on? My view is that it's probably the latter which is more important, and we have to recognise that is much more difficult to measure. If government is doing its job properly, which itself might be felt to be a subjective viewpoint, then bringing forward well-crafted legislation which has the support of stakeholders, then effective parliamentary scrutiny may not need to do much more than identify that legislation as fit for its own task. In other cases, and particularly in issues which are politically polarising, effective parliamentary scrutiny may look very different. So I will watch with interest to see what direction the committee wants to take on the measurement of effectiveness. And of course, I'll give way to Mr Carson.
Finlay Carson.
I appreciate the Minister giving way. The Minister will be no doubt aware of the letter written by Professor Mary Brennan with regards to the scrutiny of the secondary legislation regarding the Good Food Nation. And she finishes her letter by saying, "We strongly believe that it's incumbent on all those with responsibility to ensure the highest level of scrutiny and accountability are adhered to. But surely the way that the government brings forward legislation, they need to take cognizance of the capacity of the Parliament to scrutinise that in that way."
Minister.
Well, of course, and that's just what we do. And this has been the subject of some discussion in the context of this inquiry. I was giving evidence to committee just last week. I heard that obviously I engage regularly with conveners of committees as well, and sometimes there's a sense that expressed that the government is overburdening committees with a workload. But I would observe, and I was able to put this in the record last week at committee, and I'm delighted that Mr Carson gives me the opportunity to place it on record just now. The average number of government bills introduced per year, per session, has been broadly stable across all sessions. This session we projected 12 per year. Session 5 it was 12 per year. Session 4 it was 13, 3, 11. Session 2, 13. Session 1, 13. And broadly similar in terms of SSIs. It's been largely stable for the last few years, and indeed this year far less than has been across, in fact, every other calendar year since 2001. So I would recognise the responsibility of government to make sure that committees have a manageable workload, and in terms of our legislative programme, I think we're doing that. And of course, I'll go away to Mr
Douglas Ross.
Interesting point he makes about numbers, but will he also agree that some subject committees receive more legislation than others? Indeed, we discussed it this morning in the meeting he had with me as convener of the Education Committee. With non-government bills coming forward, with government bills coming forward, the Education Committee between now and the end of this Parliament will have very little capacity to do anything other than legislation. So the numbers might be the same, but certain committees will receive more than others.
Minister.
Yes, I would absolutely recognise that. I suppose what I would say for the government's own part is that we look across the range of activity that committees are undertaking. I think you can see that very clearly from the Year 5 programme that we've announced in our programme for government. We are cognisant of capacity issues at committees, and we will try and gear our programme accordingly, knowing that some committees will have more capacity. Now, that's balanced, of course, against the need to take forward the legislative programme that meets the government's ambitions. And again, of course, it is often the case that legislation will touch on the remit of more than one committee, and we should try and make sure that we balance activity in that fashion. Presiding Officer, in terms of how committees might look at these matters in terms of volume, I suppose there could also be an approach, and again, I was making this point frequently, giving evidence to the committee last week in terms of it's not for the government to say to a committee, to dictate to a committee how it might undertake its scrutiny of legislation, or indeed any particular issue. But of course, a question might be, can committees scale their approach depending on how significant an issue is, so deal with it more quickly if it's minor technical or timely, spend more time on issues which are significant of high public interest or are longer-term issues. Committees, of course, would have to make that judgment for themselves. Presiding Officer, related to that point, we have seen over time new processes and information requirements build up, and that also increases the workload for committees, but it is at the request of Parliament. The volume of information which Government must submit to Parliament, in turn the volume of information which Parliament must consider. But of course that is something that Parliament has asked us to do. But wherever there is such a requirement, then we will seek to respond accordingly. I think I'm getting the indication from you, Presiding Officer, that I have to conclude, am I? I'm not, so I'll
I can give you the time back for the
then.
interventions and a bit of extra latitude too.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. So, I wanted to touch on the issue then of pre-legislative scrutiny, whether there is scope for committees to do more of this to improve their knowledge earlier and front-load some of their consideration as an issue. And I know that's an issue that the Standards Committee has been looking at. Could committees front-load some of their scrutiny whilst policy development is underway by engaging in consultations or discussing with lead ministers at that earlier stage on a more regular basis? That could then have the benefit of ensuring that there is a reduction in the time required to scrutinise the final product later, albeit, of course, it would be in the hands of committee to determine how much time should be allocated, because there has been involvement earlier on. And I don't see anything inconsistent with a committee being able to inform legislation that is then subject to scrutinising further down the line. I think that would be something that would be perfectly capable for our committees to do. Yes, briefly.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to the Minister to take time. I think he opens an interesting question in respect of the contribution a committee can make to what a bill looks like compared to the requirement to scrutinise the bill. And is he comfortable, and I phrase that very carefully, is he comfortable with considering a committee can, in essence, contribute to what a bill should look like and then successfully scrutinise it for the purposes of parliamentary needs?
Minister.
I mean, in short, yes, I think that's perfectly possible. I suppose it would still be in the hands of the Government to consider what the committee has said and then draft its legislation accordingly. And the committee might feel that that's, the points it's raised haven't been taken fully into account when it takes forward the process of scrutinising it once it is further developed. I see no inconsistency with a committee being able to participate in both parts of the process of scrutiny. Presiding Officer, let me conclude by saying I look forward to hearing what members across the Chamber have to say this afternoon. Again, I would emphasise these matters are not for Government to dictate to Parliament. Of course, the Scottish Government is always ready, willing and happy to support these considerations in the appropriate way.
Thank you very much. I now call Jackson Carlaw, around 6 minutes. Mr.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. As a child of the 1950s, I realise I am the oldest MSP contributing to the debate this afternoon, but I would reassure the Minister that I have no first-hand recollection of the events of 1774 or earlier, so I'm not able to populate his request in quite the way he might have expected. Now, I realise there is a special meeting of the Parliament taking place this afternoon in Hamilton and Lark Hall, but I am immediately impressed at the quality of the contributions that I have been able to witness so far in the debate this afternoon. I don't know if there is a collective noun for so many conveners leading a debate here in the Parliament this afternoon, but I enjoyed hearing from Audrey Nicholl, from Richard Leonard and, of course, from Kenny Gibson, and I would join in Stephen Kerr's tribute to Kenny Gibson. It's my job, as it was once yours, Deputy Presiding Officer, on behalf of the corporate body to present the Parliament's budget to the Finance Committee each year. And I'm always a model of circumspection and moderation in so doing, and I'm always immensely impressed at the robust handling of the issues we discuss when I present the budget from the convener, especially when it comes to the issue of MSP remuneration. Now we have, I think, are there any changes to the Parliament's procedures and practices which would help the committees to work more effectively? And I think the challenge out of the discussion this afternoon is very much one that reminds me of the early days of the coalition government, when they sought to embrace the challenge of House of Lords reform, in that one might have thought with a coalition rather than a majority government that the land lay best placed for some sort of collective agreement to emerge. But in fact, every one of the proposals, some of which were eminently sensible, found a different coalition of interests that were opposed to them, so that in fact nothing then transpired. And I think the challenge for the committee will be to take forward some of what I think will be almost a certain amount of agreed thinking within the chamber this afternoon into something that might actually lead to the Parliament being more effective. Because when this Parliament was created, it joined those of North Korea, Nicaragua, Mozambique, China and Cuba in being unicameral. And the suggestion was we didn't need another chamber, and of course we don't. We are one of the most overgoverned countries. The last thing we need is a second chamber. But the promise was that our committee system would be the kind of vanguard, the kind of bulwark of the democratic accountability in counteracting inappropriate or badly drafted or the wrong legislation. And the question before us is, have we actually succeeded in doing that? And the answer is sometimes, but not always. And I think that really leads to the issues before us today. And I very much sympathise, for example, with the gender balance issue, that there should not be single-sex committees. I'm the convener of one myself now. It didn't start that way. But of course, we had a woman on it who was promoted to another committee. Then there wasn't another woman available to put in her place. Another committee member left, and that party then had two women in very rapid succession before replacing them with a man. And then another party changed its representative, but declined to appoint a woman to it. And the way in which our committees are constructed makes it very difficult, I think, to find a formula that will achieve that without actually having a lot of red tape at the start of the session that says that the parties not only will abide by d'Hondt, but that they will have to nominate a member of a particular sex in order to achieve the continuity of that balance. And I very much take the point that if we don't have gender balance in the Parliament, it certainly would have, in the case of the Conservative Party, had led to far more work falling on a handful of our representatives, who, of course, with continuity being a very difficult thing to achieve, not just because people are promoted within their particular party to take on more senior roles, which changes the face of their representation. It can be very difficult to achieve, and we've had that problem too. I mean, the Minister referred to the report which we've published, our final recommendations on deliberative democracy, which the Chamber will debate early in June. There are only 2 of the 5 of us left who have actually been through the whole of that committee inquiry and been part of every stage of the development of the recommendations we've made. Now, we have got some the Conservative Party is, of course, the only party in this chamber that has never had a taste of government in the devolved era. And so we don't have the same vested interests that the other parties do in maintaining certain sort of safeguards, because our own view is that we should do away with d'Hondt in the construction of committees. Because if we were to do so, then, first of all, the smaller parties would have greater representation across the various committees that exist, but that it would achieve that ambition of the committees being more independent of government and being able, I think, to scrutinise with more authority. So our own view is that that would be a way of trying to give additional emphasis to the notion that the committees are, in fact, an essential part of holding the government and ensuring there is a democratic accountability. I'm not sure that we're altogether sure about whether or not there should be elected conveners or not. I was part of the previous presiding officers commission that first suggested elected conveners and remunerated conveners. I'm not sure about that, but what I am sure about is that a number of conveners, particularly on the conveners group itself, which is actually a group I think we could do without in some respects, because I'm not quite sure what it achieves, greatest respect to yourself, who chairs it, Deputy Presiding Officer, but notwithstanding that, it seems that different conveners are unsure about what their own level of authority and responsibility actually is. And I think that rather, almost more important than them being elected or them being remunerated, would be clear understanding of what the authority of a committee convener is to act. Because I'm aware that some feel able to act and others feel constrained by the committee as to what they can do. And I think that probably interferes with the democratic accountability. I'd also like to see, we would like to see the creation probably of a full-time post-legislative scrutiny committee. I know this is something, it's not an original idea. We've gone round the houses. I hope that deliberative democracy might offer an opportunity. I don't think the deliberative democracy model was particularly successful, but we know that we're all supposed to do more post-legislative scrutiny, but we're unable to within the construction and the constraints that exist. So that is, I think, our principal view in relation to the committee, to committee size. I think the smaller the committee, the better. 5 to 7, I think, has worked better, but in our model of doing away with D'Hondt would probably have more opportunity for authority and for representation from other parties. I hope there is a general interest here. I mean, normally, you know, if you're in the Conservative Party, you get a Whip's broadcast, and if it says no divisions expected, you rather feel you've been consigned to the graveyard shift on a Thursday afternoon on the basis that everybody else may have left. But I hope, notwithstanding the fact that we are here on a Thursday afternoon discussing this, that there is a genuine, rather than that you will be here to discuss this afternoon, interest. I can see everybody who has contributed so far wants to contribute and has genuine personal experience and ideas to contribute. I hope we can translate them into something which the committee convener can actually take forward in a meaningful way that achieves the change that we would like to see.
Thank you, Mr Carlow. As a small concession that I'm sure you'll be delighted about, the convener's group is cancelled to next month. I now call Rhoda Grant. Around 5 minutes, Ms Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I also thank the Standards, Procedure and Public Appointments Committee for this debate and indeed their inquiry into committee effectiveness. We must review and improve our procedures to ensure the Parliament operates always to the highest standards. Our committees are there to hold government to account and to test legislation. Members must leave their party allegiance at the door and hold government to account. And some would argue that the role is different for government members when they're dealing with legislation, given government party members stood on a manifesto promoting that same legislation. I don't think anyone would expect committee... Yeah.
Thank you very much for taking the intervention. I think that's a really important area you've touched on. I think, though, it's important for all of us that legislation is of quality, it's robust, it delivers for the people of Scotland. So it serves no one's interest if government members actually go soft on government ministers when, in fact, they need to be more robust in specific instances.
Rhoda Grant.
Indeed, and that was the point I was going to go on to make, because legislation must be tested to make sure it does what it's meant to do, it doesn't have unintended consequences, and it is really good legislation. And I think that benefits the government as well, because their legislation is all the better because of it. But at the same time, I don't think anyone expects committee members to leave their own personal beliefs at the door as they go into committee, and that sometimes also directs the approach they take. It's difficult to see how we can do all of that, though sometimes in a very partisan parliament, how we leave our party politics at the door. One of the proposals being brought forward is that we elect committee conveners, and we believe that that would help. It would obviously have to be under the D'Hondt system, so candidates could only be from one party, but it would give scope for a different career path for MSPs. Rather than looking to be a government minister or cabinet secretary, they could look to being a committee convener. And it would also provide opportunities for those who may not be in favour with their own party and may never hope to aspire to committee convenership otherwise. And if we excluded cabinet secretaries and ministers from casting a vote in the ballot, it would also ensure that the government couldn't unduly influence those elections. We also agree that having...
You would surely recognise, though, and I've got to be careful what I say here, of course, that not every minister might remain a minister for the entire duration of Parliament. So how would she deal with that notion that those who have been disenfranchised might then find themselves subject to being in the backbenches and on a committee?
Rhoda Grant.
And that would also work for those who were promoted into ministerial and cabinet secretary positions who had already cast a vote and were then subject to scrutiny by that same committee. But that would be something we would simply have to live with, because I don't think any of us are so arrogant that we cast a vote expecting to be in an elevated position, and none of us are probably looking at our demotion so clearly as when we're looking to cast a vote. The Minister may disagree. We also need to not shy away from setting up short-life committees. Sometimes the committee structure is so stuck in the Parliament that we can't do things that are a bit more flexible. We should look at short-life committees, setting up subcommittees or joint subcommittees of 2 or more committees, if that's useful, because I think that gives us the flexibility to react to circumstances as they come. I absolutely agree that there should be no single-sex committees, and Scottish Labour work hard to ensure that our group does have gender balance, and we must never stop doing that.
I have been interested in the discussion about this, and if I understand correctly, the SPPA committee, which is looking at this, has all female committee members apart from the convener. Would the member be comfortable if a committee had all female members and a good female committee member had to be taken off to be replaced by a male?
Rhoda Grant.
You know, I really look forward to the day that has to happen. I can't conceive of it, but I sincerely hope it does happen, and I would be willing to come off if that was the case. Because, you know, our Parliament should really be representative of the communities we represent. And I think if we had the balance, the gender balance within the Parliament, then single-sex committees would not be an issue at all. But signing up to the ideal of no single-sex committees without challenging parties to have better gender equality does exactly what Jackie Dunbar was talking about, and indeed Jackson Carlo himself talked about, that women would end up working harder than men. And that, I'm sure every woman in this Parliament would argue we already work harder than men, as it is, and we wouldn't want to work any harder than that. So it also casts up the issue that if we had single-sex parties, and that would be incredibly disappointing, but if they wouldn't be able to prevent a committee being a single-sex committee if they were the last party to nominate, and that again would cause problems for other parties. Should they forgo their committee membership? Should another woman step in? What should happen in that way? So the simple way of avoiding all that is making sure that all parties pursue gender equality in their MSP group. And I'm running out of time, taking a number of interventions. But, you know, just to conclude by saying it's essential we review and refresh our procedures to keep our Parliament responsive to the need of our communities. We need to review our committees, and we need to review the legislation and have post-legislative scrutiny as well built into our processes. And there may be opportunities, I think, to do that at the start of a Parliament when legislation has not come forward. So we need to look at using that time to train committee members, but also let them review previous legislation that will give them an insight into that committee's work. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Grant. And I call Lorna Slater again, around 5 minutes. Ms Slater.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Green Group submitted quite a detailed paper on this inquiry, and I'm really grateful that this work is being undertaken. We feel that there is significant improvement needed to how our parliamentary committees work in order to improve scrutiny of the Scottish Government, particularly post-legislative scrutiny and scrutiny of public bodies. The Scottish Government is prone to setting itself targets and setting out intentions without following up and taking the action needed to meet these. We've seen this disastrously with Scotland's high-level climate targets, but also with what we might call the supporting targets to these, like on recycling, reduction of waste, reduction of car kilometres and so on. It should be the role of committees to circle back on legislation that has been passed setting out targets and immediately and persistently demand implementation plans. Costs, effectiveness and progress must all be followed up diligently, or we let the Scottish Government get away with saying we have the most ambitious climate targets in the world for years, which covers up the truth that they haven't taken the actions needed to meet those targets, to the point that they're now rushing around having to erase those targets. Secondly, committee inquiries, while often of very high quality, frequently lead to no action. There should be structured follow-up to ensure that recommendations are implemented. If follow-up isn't feasible within the parliamentary session, legacy reports should explicitly recommend that successor committees prioritise it. Aligning committee work with government priorities could help ensure that feedback is received at a time when the government is working on the subject, and would help ensure that work is taken into consideration at the right time. Thirdly, the Scottish Greens feel that budget scrutiny is largely ineffective and requires a complete overhaul. There were reforms agreed between the Parliament and Government around budget scrutiny in the last session, but we need to understand how those are being progressed. Within the budget scrutiny process, evaluating how budget decisions align with government strategy and stated priorities is nearly impossible. Take, for example, the government's stated intention to reach net zero by 2045. How can the Parliament understand whether the budget is taking us in that direction? Some budget lines, dualling roads, will clearly increase emissions, whereas others, reform of agricultural subsidies, should reduce them. But by how much? What are the trade-offs that the government is making? Without this information, we cannot scrutinise the budget effectively. The Scottish Government will now be moving to carbon budgeting. This is an opportunity to fix the process and to match financial budget lines with carbon budget lines, so that the Parliament can clearly see how both budgets are being balanced. Committees should also have a clearer role in monitoring progress against the National Performance Framework. How do we know that what the government is doing is in line with their stated priorities? Fifthly, the lack of post-legislative scrutiny is a significant issue. At present, the first half of parliamentary terms can be taken up pursuing members' personal interests, which has the result of reducing the time available to pursue new or amend existing legislation within the term. If the first half of parliamentary sessions were dedicated to post-legislative scrutiny, ensuring laws, especially framework legislation, are functioning as intended before committees move onto new inquiries, that would resolve this problem. And the final point that I'll put into my opening speech, I'll put some of the others into my closing perhaps, is that parliamentary committees are failing to provide adequate scrutiny of SPCB-supported bodies and public bodies beyond the government as well. Important findings from the SPCB-supported bodies, and indeed from other public bodies, are often ignored due to a lack of committee mandate to engage with their work. Parliamentary committees should have duties and mechanisms to effectively scrutinise other public bodies, such as Environmental Standards Scotland. A structured approach, similar to the Audit Committee's weekly sessions with the Auditor-General, would improve oversight. I've got a bit of time, I'll carry on a bit. In our paper, the Scottish Greens also describe how committee structures and practices could be improved. More business time in the chamber should be allocated to committee-led debates, which would require that committees have ideas of what they like to debate, because these debates tend to be more informed and constructive and less cut across party lines. The Scottish Greens feel that at the moment a large amount of chamber time is wasted on repetitive and unproductive debates, partly due to the government reluctance to risk losing votes, and partly because opposition parties don't push for more substantive discussions. Bad behaviour in committees, such as badgering witnesses or talking over conveners, should absolutely not be tolerated. Conveners should enforce decorum and protect witnesses from targeted attacks. Mechanisms should be in place to call out inappropriate behaviour without fear of retaliation. Committee conveners should be elected rather than appointed based on party agreements. The current system allows larger parties, especially the governing party, to use convenerships as reward for backbenchers, reducing the independence and effectiveness of committees. This was actually a recommendation of the Parliamentary Commission established by the previous presiding officer, but it has not been enacted in this session, which is disappointing. Party and gender balance on committees should be prioritised to ensure diverse representation. I note from some of the comments earlier that there is, of course, a difference between perfect gender balance and single-sex committees. Wiggle room, as it were, where parties don't have good gender balance in this Parliament. But the electing of conveners should be structured to avoid popularity contests and to ensure that those chosen are committed to rigorous scrutiny. Cross-committee collaboration should be standard practice to address issues that cut across departmental lines. This would help overcome siloed working and ensure comprehensive scrutiny of multifaceted issues. And finally, committees should have greater powers, including the ability to compel witnesses to appear and to strengthen their oversight capabilities. Sure.
Stephen Kerr.
That Lorna Slater will find that in the Scotland Act, the committees of this Parliament do have the power to compel witnesses to appear before them. I think we already enjoy that privilege in this Parliament, something, by the way, that the Westminster Parliament does not enjoy.
Lorna Slater.
I'm very grateful for correcting me on that point if I indeed have got that wrong, although I note that at least one UK government minister refused to appear before Scottish parliaments when requested to do so in writing, and that would be a good power to have.
Thank you, Ms Slater. We now move to the open debate. I call first Emma Roddick to be followed by Finlay Carson. Around 4 minutes. Ms Roddick.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to get a couple of things out of the way just before I start. Firstly, can I reassure Jackson Carlo that nobody had to bully me to take part in the debate this afternoon? You can check with my whips. I was well up for it. Secondly, I know that many committees have done excellent work in this Parliament, and I hope that their members, their conveners and anybody who gave evidence will understand that any criticisms I make of the structures are absolutely no criticism of the work that they have done, and I think actually it makes any successes that much more impressive. Now, I've sat on 4 committees, subbed to and appeared in 2 others as a minister. So I know that they are busy, often overloaded, and the inquiries that are carried out often give much-needed air to issues that really matter to constituents, are very important and very worthy of time, but maybe aren't quite as flashy when it comes to discussing them in the chamber, maybe much like this debate. But they do not have enough power, and I'm afraid they don't also have enough respect. My experience has taught me that the convener and their approach makes a huge difference to the effectiveness of a committee and the experience of both members and witnesses. A convener that doesn't allow members to pursue non-spiced lines of questioning or overloads panels or doesn't show an interest in detail or approaching difficult subjects can create a very dispiriting environment. A convener that creates a culture of interest, curiosity and participation or brings bacon rolls to meetings can really make a difference. Respect towards committees and the issues that they raise from government and media is also incredibly important, and I do wish I could think of an effective way to prevent party whipping in committees. One particular example of good work is what was undertaken in the Social Justice and Social Security Committee under the convenership of Elena Whittam. At the end of an inquiry, we published the report Robbing Peter to Pay Paul, Low Income and the Debt Trap. And it was hailed by third sector campaigners, by those we took evidence from and by MSPs across parties. And it really felt like we'd achieved something, along with the support of Clarks and Spice in pulling together everything that we've considered into recommendations. And the response from government was just a huge disappointment to me as a fairly new MSP. One witness in this inquiry pointed out that it is hard to measure effectiveness. There's no committee impact factor KPI yet. So is it how many amendments the committee makes to a bill or how many reports it publishes? And what about recommendations that are initially ignored by government but then make it into the next budget or manifesto drawing up without any credit given to the committee with its report already forgotten? And that's an interesting question and one that can only really be answered if we do more post-legislative scrutiny and follow-up work. Now, I know from my own experience that committees often don't feel they have enough time to do these things, but it is critical if we want to be more effective. The convener earlier mentioned time that committees have, and I do think we need to ask ourselves some serious questions about whether the value that we place on committees is reflected in the parliamentary timetable. From giving over some afternoons of chamber business to separate bill committees, there are a lot of solutions out there, but they do always seem to lead to what's a very difficult question for MSPs, including ones like me who sit on 3 committees. Even with smaller committees, are there enough of us to meaningfully improve scrutiny? I've got a lot of sympathy for the issues raised in terms of remuneration. I believe that's critical to strengthening the whole system. I've worked under many excellent conveners and I've seen the work that they are expected to do. It is a whole other job on top of being a backbencher, much like being a deputy presiding officer or a junior minister. And if we want MSPs, particularly those who are in one of the parties of government, to take their convenership seriously in its own right and not just see it as a stepping stone, then it must be remunerated in a way that recognises and encourages the level of work that's needed. Now, committees should and can be incredibly effective. Issues should be spotted and fixed in committees, not in the press or with another bill next session. And ministers should be terrified to appear in front of us. So I hope that this inquiry results in some change in structure to facilitate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Roddick. I now call Finlay Carson to be followed by Faisal Chowdhury. Around 4 minutes. Mr Carson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to contribute to this important debate on the effectiveness of our parliamentary committees. Whilst I convene the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee, I speak today in a personal capacity. This inquiry comes at a critical time when public trust, transparency and accountability are paramount. Committees are the cornerstone of our scrutiny in our unicameral legislature. They are where legislation is tested, stakeholders are heard and detail is examined. Yet the evidence presented to this inquiry shows that our current system is falling short. But let me begin by recognising the dedication of committee members across the chamber, many investing significant time and effort. But we must also be honest about the structural, procedural and cultural barriers that limit our effectiveness. From my experience convening the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee covering agriculture, fisheries, animal welfare, rural development and island communities, I've seen how vital it is for committees to be both informed and empowered. Yet our ability to scrutinise is often constrained by the very structures of the committee. Effective scrutiny requires an environment, both physical and cultural, where decisions are well informed and solutions are robust. But the dual role of committees as both legislative and scrutiny bodies restricts their capacity for inquiry and often turns them into mini chambers. We need structural reforms that make committees more open and less bound by party lines. Flawed set-up, for example. The Conservatives have been quite clear. The government majorities on most committees have created a culture where scrutiny is sidelined. Legislation is nodded through and dissenting voices are drowned out, not by debate but by design. This concern is shared across parties. The Scottish Greens noted that committee inquiries frequently lead to no action. The SCVO expressed frustration at the lack of follow-through, and Scottish Labour acknowledged that committees do not fulfil their intended role. So what can we do? Well, first, we must reform committee composition. The Commission on Parliamentary Reform recommended smaller committees and elected conveners, but smaller must not mean less representative. In a diverse Parliament, we must ensure all voices, especially from my perspective, from rural and island communities, are heard. Secondly, we must address continuity. The high rate of turnover I've witnessed in my committee weakens institutional memory and disrupts inquiry flow. Continuity builds expertise and trust, which are essential for effective scrutiny. Third, we need better follow-up and accountability. Too often committee reports are published, debated briefly and then forgotten. We need structured processes to track implementation and revisit inquiries. Fourth, committees must be properly resourced. Effective scrutiny requires time, expertise and support. And that means investing in our fantastic clerks, our research staff and access to data. And we do need continuity within the clerking team as well. Fifth, and I welcome the committee's commitment to gender balance and eliminating single-sex committees, but we must go further. We must support participation from underrepresented groups, including ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, and again those who represent rural and island communities. We must also reflect on whether our institutional architecture supports thoughtful, evidence-based decision-making. Yes, I'll give way.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to Finlay Carson to take an intervention. One of the things that's buried in standing orders is a member's expertise to be on a committee, and that should be one of the things that's considered by the Bureau when the things come forward. Would you agree with me, and I think he would, that part of that should be the geographic representation, the skill set, the lived experience of the MSP, and perhaps we should pay far more credit, or be in a position to be able to pay far more credit to that than we can do at the moment?
Finlay Carson.
I absolutely agree. I appreciate that intervention, and I think you'll see that the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee sits on a Wednesday, and that was very much a decision, I believe, it was taken to ensure those who were representing our more remote communities could always be there without impinging too much on their family time or getting to Parliament after a weekend. But, while the architects of this Parliament created physical spaces like the infamous members' thinking pods, our systems don't always allow time for that reflection. If consensus is our goal, why does it remain so elusive? We should explore options such as more but smaller committees, meeting perhaps fortnightly, or spreading inquiry and legislative functions. Separating, I should say, similar to the House of Commons. We should see maybe ad hoc bill committees. Since 1999, 2 Scotland Acts and the EU exit have significantly increased our policy load, as has the increasingly popular adoption of framework bills, resulting in significantly more work, as secondary legislation is where all the heavy lifting now takes place. But has the Parliament adapted? Well, we're equipped to address the scale of the. Are we equipped to address the scale of the climate change or nature crisis, or does our structure hinder us? The question is whether tweaking the existing system is enough, or whether more substantial reform is needed. Presiding Officer, effective scrutiny is not about opposition for its own sake. It's about ensuring legislation is well crafted, policies are evidence-based, and citizens' voices, especially, again from my perspective, from rural areas, are heard and respected. This inquiry is an opportunity to reset the balance, to build a committee system that is independent, effective and truly fit for purpose. And I urge all members to support meaningful reform, not to just improve our processes, but to strengthen our democracy.
Thank you. Just to advise the Chamber, the generous additional time we had in hand before has close to been exhausted, so I'm going to have to encourage members to stick slightly closer to their speaking allocation times. I call Faisal Chowdhury to be followed by Rona Mackay, around 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to begin by extending my thanks to the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointment Committee for their work on this inquiry so far. With our Parliament having no upper house, the work of the committee is extremely important in the scrutiny of legislation, holding ministers to account and bringing forward issues that matter to the public. I believe the work of our committees can show the very best of Parliament. They are envisioned as being the engine of Parliament, and any good engine needs to be serviced. I sit on the Citizen Participation and Public Petition Committee, which, in my biased view, Presiding Officer, is one of the best committee in Parliament. We can directly respond to and raise constituent concern across portfolios. We have a varied programme. Last November, we published our inquiry into the dwelling of the A9. And this week, we considered the microchipping of cats. However, one problem the Petition Committee faces is that its membership is currently all male. We frequently hear and respond to petitions which relate to issues we have no lived experience of. While members do often join to give evidences on these issues where they have interest, we should be looking to embed that in the structure of the committee by mandating that none can be single-sex. In the evidence given to the committee, the value of collaboration in committees was highlighted, where members can allow themselves to put party politics aside and work together the common goal of the committee. The size of committee, some with up to 11 people, was mentioned as possibly hindering this. The Petition Committee is small, with only 5 members. I believe that has allowed us to be agile in work and get less bogged down on smaller issues. Elected conveners could also work to improve the efficiency of committee. This would give them mandate to pursue their priorities and motivate them to share their views on the committee's future work, to persuade others to vote for them. Elected conveners could also increase the profile of committee and turn them into the independent engines of Parliament they were intended to be. In summary, Presiding Officer, while our committees do great work, we should be looking to improve them. This can be most easily done in ending single-sex committees, but there are opportunities in bringing in forward elected conveners and enhancing committee powers. I again thank the committee for their work on this matter, and I'll look forward to seeing the final report in autumn.
Thank you. I now call Rona Mackay to be followed by Stephen Kerr. Up to 4 minutes. Ms Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be able to speak in this debate on an important subject that isn't routinely debated in this Parliament. As a relatively new substitute member on the Standards Committee, I found the inquiry into committee effectiveness fascinating. Because in my view, like Faisal Chowdhury, the committees are the engine rooms of this wonderful Parliament, whether taking evidence on important legislation or initiating vitally important inquiries on subjects that affect the whole of the population of Scotland. The questions which were central to the inquiry were: what does it mean for committees of the Scottish Parliament to be effective? How could we do better? And how and where and how is this being communicated to the public for maximum engagement and effect? We took evidence from a wide range of witnesses and gained a useful insight into the operation of parliaments from different legislators. We heard from academics, civil servants, past and present, and representatives from all 6 parties in the Parliament. All the evidence helped to build a picture of how our committees operate and how, after 26 years of this Parliament, they could be improved. Presiding Officer, as the convener and many others have said, the size of committees was crucial to our deliberations, with many witnesses stating that small committees work best, and that's been well articulated throughout the Chamber today. The downside of having smaller committees would be that not every party could be represented under the D'Hondt system, and I know we have discussed that today too. And that system is attempted to reflect parties' allocation in Parliament across all the committees, and the Scottish Government are clear that it would be for Parliament to determine whether that representation should change. The gender-sensitive audit marks the importance of a Parliament representative of society, and as a member of the gender-sensitive audit panel, I fully support that. However, gender balance is only possible where the Parliament has good gender balance to start with, and that lies with the party's ability to attract diversity and good gender balance during the selection process. So we also examined how the process of elected conveners work, something which currently operates in Westminster. The Scottish Government doesn't have a position on this, but I personally am not convinced that in a Parliament of 129 members that would be the best route to take, or it could be easily introduced. Indeed, much of the evidence we received from Westminster witnesses, while interesting, was not really relevant to Holyrood due to the comparable number of elected members. It was agreed that churn in committee is not ideal, but often just not preventable, and Jackson Carlaw articulated that perfectly. Changing membership can hinder members from building the expertise they need to scrutinise legislation effectively. Post-legislative scrutiny, or the lack of time to do it, was also discussed. It was felt that the legislative workload of most committees and the length of time now being taken to complete bills didn't allow adequate time to do this important task. It was also agreed that collaborative working between members, leaving party politics aside, made for more effective committees. As a long-standing member of the Criminal Justice Committee, I can actually testify to that. And as others have said, I believe that comes down to the role of conveners, and we have excellent ones in Audrey Nicholl and in Martin Whitfield, and of course in Kenny Gibson, and they just unify the committee in a fair and considered way, and I think that makes for a far better outcome. So, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, time doesn't allow a comprehensive account of our inquiry, but I believe we can be very proud of our committee system and with the help of skilled backup from our clerks and research teams. But the structure should always be a work in progress and there will always be room for improvement. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Mackay. And I call Stephen Kerr 4 minutes. Mr. Kerr.
And I think that is a good introduction to my remarks, actually, and that's why I'm grateful to the member for it. We should be committed to continual improvement. Everything can get better. And one of the things that could get better, for example, and I hope the committee at one time might look at this, is debate management. Because here we are in an important debate, and those of us who are on the back benches who waited an hour and 10 minutes to speak now must stick to our 4 minutes. Whereas previously, everyone was taking as much time as they liked. I don't think that's a very good way to manage the time for debate in the Chamber, and I've given suggestions in the past about how to improve it. And I'm going to model the very behaviour of independent thinking and opinion because, that we've been speaking of, because I don't agree with everything that my own party has submitted to the committee for consideration in respect to the future of committees. And I'll spell out exactly why, in which areas that is, and I'm sure everyone will be absolutely scintillated to hear that. The reality is that we do have this single legislative chamber. And the committees are absolutely not intended to be a supporting act. They are supposed to be the engine of scrutiny. The question is, do they do that? And I think the answer is obvious, frankly. And while we may take a lot of pride in the nature of the setup of our Parliament, indeed, in its day, there was much promised. It's going to be innovative, progressive, it's going to be distinctly Scottish. But sometimes you've got to be careful that our pride in what lies in the past doesn't stop us from realising where the system as it stands today, after 25 years, is falling short. So after 5 years, we really should be asking ourselves, are our committees delivering on the promise that we thought they contained when the Parliament was established? Or have they become under party control, burdened, overburdened, under-resourced, and frankly too often ignored? And I've already said, and there are a number of conveners in the room who I have got a lot of admiration for, because of the independence of mind that they have and the way that they go about the work of their committee. That isn't true of every convener, and it isn't true of every committee of this Parliament. So let me be blunt. I believe the current committee system is failing to meet its original purpose. And unless we act decisively, this Parliament will continue, I believe, to fall short of the democratic standards that the people of Scotland deserve. And the problems are structural. They're not tied to individuals. But they're not incidental problems. They're structural problems. The committees are too often dominated by party tribalism, by party discipline. The long reach of the whips is in the committees. We shouldn't tolerate that as parliamentarians. The committees should be completely independent of the control of the whips.
Kenneth Gibson.
I also agree that the sterility of some committees whereby Spice and the clerks write the questions does actually reduce flexibility. It discourages independent thinking of members and indeed channels members in a certain way at committees rather than allowing a much greater interpretation of what's actually happening before them.
Stephen Kerr,
that's a brilliant intervention. I couldn't agree more with the member. Absolutely right. We need to encourage independence of thinking, because that is the bedrock upon which a parliament exists. And unless we have that, then we are falling short in our responsibilities in holding this great public office of being a member of the Scottish Parliament. I repeat again, the parties need to butt out of the committees, and we all need to live up to the expectations the people of Scotland have in us as holders of the office of Member of the Scottish Parliament. And just to touch on a couple of other things, because time's already it's run out, is the issue of committee changes. Completely agree with that. I've mentioned making the committees free of the whips. There's a workload imbalance. There's too much regimentation about how we go about things in the Parliament. There are only so many hours, apparently, in which a committee can meet. I think we need to be more liberal in the way that we see the parliamentary week. And we should meet as often and for as long as is necessary for the committee to do its work. But there's just too many standing order restrictions around that. I will give way, but I know I'm going to get... Am I not allowed to give way?
You should be winding up at this point, Mr Kerr.
I will give way, though.
I thank the member for
Audrey
giving
Nicholl,
me...
briefly.
Just on that point, and just referring to a point that Jackson Carlo made, conveners sometimes find it quite difficult to make that balance between being too liberal and flexible in a committee, but making sure that there is the expected formality with that. Would you agree with that?
I agree with that. And I also agree that there should be proper support for the conveners to be able to grow into the roles. I think that's a very important part of it too. I think to be truly independent as a convener, you need to have the mandate of every member of this Parliament. So I'm strongly in favour of elected conveners. And I'm also in favour of remuneration for committee conveners. Because, frankly, I do not believe for 1 minute that the workload of a committee convener is any less than a deputy presiding officer or a junior minister. And I think actually in so many different ways, in terms of the power balance between Parliament and Executive, it's even more important that we have independent, fully functional conveners. And I know my time is up, but I do make my point again that we need to do better at managing our debates.
Thank you, Mr Kerr. I didn't want to interrupt your flow earlier on, but just to point out, the time we had in before wasn't to allow members to continue well beyond their time. It was to allow for interventions, a number of which you made yourself, Mr Kerr, and to allow members then to still have the time back, in the same way as you have had, Mr Kerr. I now call the final speaker in the open debate, Ash Regan, up to 4 minutes. Ms Regan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think this is an important inquiry, and I've enjoyed listening to the contributions this afternoon. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to give evidence to it last week, which, as a very small party, is obviously it's good for us to be able to take part in these things because, in fact, due to the system we currently have, I'm not entitled to even a committee place at the moment as a member of a very small party. In my time here, which is I think it's just over the 9 years now, I've been on 8 committees. I've also been in government, so I've been now on both sides of the table, both in and out of government, and on the government benches and on the opposition benches. And I think it's fair to say that over the last few years, my views on committee effectiveness have very much developed. Let's leave it there. So I think committees are meant to be the heart of scrutiny in this Parliament, but I agree with some of the speakers I've already spoken. Too often the structure, which Stephen Kerr was pointing out, is very much undermining the purpose that we're here to carry out. Members are often overstretched, some convenerships appear very partisan, and there seems to be often limited coordination between committees, which I think serves to weaken the quality of our legislative oversight. And smaller parties and independent MSPs, which we may see more of in the next Parliament, I think struggle to have meaningful input into it. And I just want to say at the outset, before I go on to the substantive part of my speech, that there are many, many examples of excellent work by committees in this Parliament, both on inquiries and on scrutiny of legislation. And there are some excellent conveners sitting in the chamber with us this afternoon. But unfortunately, that isn't always the case. And I wanted to use my time just to give and to put on the record, because I believe this is very important, of an example of what I see as very significant failure by committee and by Parliament in an area, and you'll not be surprised to hear me say that it's on the Gender Recognition Reform Bill. I believe that showed how serious the structural flaws have become. I think that from the outset, credible legal experts, women's groups and statutory bodies raised what they felt were very urgent concerns about the interaction between the gender recognition certificates and the Equality Act of 2010. And they weren't abstract legal theories, they were serious warnings about human rights and about the clarity of the law. But instead of being interrogated with care, these concerns were repeatedly dismissed. So I think we need to be very candid, and we need to face this as a Parliament, that the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee failed in its core duty of scrutiny. It did not fully investigate the most contentious issue in the bill, and it did not challenge the government's legal stance.
Point of order, Rona Mackay.
Just to get your guidance, please, Presiding Officer. I think the member's straying very far from the subject matter of this committee debate, and I don't think this is the place for personal recollections.
Thank you, Ms Mackay. I would say with regards to the conduct of committees, it is a matter ordinarily for the convener of the committee, but I'm content that Ms Regan continues.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When the Court of Session issued a ruling during the week of the stage 3 of that bill, which contradicted the Scottish Government's position Even that was then ignored. There wasn't an emergency session called, there wasn't a formal briefing given to MSPs on how it might affect how they might vote. Manuscript amendments that were submitted by the Conservatives seeking to address the ruling were blocked. And that wasn't scrutiny, in my opinion. It was strategic avoidance of certain issues. And worse still, the conduct of the committee since has only deepened public unease. Last month, the deputy convener of that committee, although I will say some of the personnel has changed, publicly described the Supreme Court's decision and, by implication, its senior judges as motivated by bigotry, prejudice and hatred. This wasn't a critique of the legal arguments involved. This was, I believe, a smear on the judiciary. And such rhetoric from a senior figure charged with upholding equality standards has brought this Parliament into disrepute, and I think it has exposed the lack of checks and accountability within our committee system. So I think the problem is clear. When committees scrutinise legislation and then they mark their own homework in post-legislative review, we get defensiveness and not learning. I can see I'm running out of time, Presiding Officer. I had much more to say about legislative impact and post-leg scrutiny, and also on things like elected convenerships and so on, but I'm afraid I'll have to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. We move to winding up speeches, and I call on Lorna Slater.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I don't have very much more to add over my opening remarks, which I managed to really crank through. I think what I've heard today is a cross-party agreement that continuous improvement is something that we'd all welcome. I think there is an opportunity for all of us to reflect on how we can be sure that ourselves and our fellow committee members understand topics better, whether that is taking the time to read the papers properly, coming up with our own questions before we ask them. And parties maybe need to think about that in terms of when they're nominating people who are on these committees. I'm interested in the conversation around smaller committees and the d'Hondt system. I'm obviously torn on that matter, being part of a smaller party, in the sense that we, of course, would love to be represented on all committees, but every single one of our members is currently on at least 2 committees, and that's a heavy workload for all of us. So something to be thinking of going forward. One of the things that occurs to me is we have heard repeatedly across the chamber about uneven workloads, some committees being very, very heavily burdened and others underburdened. I'm interested in the system that they have in New Zealand, which is also a unicameral system, also an additional member parliament. They have only 120 members, and yet they support around 20 committees, a mix of subject committees and specialist committees. Perhaps we can learn from other countries. I don't know if there's anything to learn there about how to share the burden out and how to set up specialist committees such that we can be more effective with the resources that we have. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, and I call on Sarah Boyack.
Okay, thank you. I might go slightly further than that 1.41 seconds. I think this has been a really important debate, actually, because it has been quite cross-party and it's been cross-experienced. And those jokes about how long people have been here. I mean, I've seen the difference between being a cabinet member, being a committee convener, the different dynamics. And I do think there are issues that we should be thinking about in terms of the role of committee conveners, because they're absolutely critical to the effectiveness of this Parliament. And people have talked about the nature of what our committees need to do is central to how this Parliament was designed. Engaging with stakeholders, holding ministers to account, scrutinising legislation, carrying out post-legislative scrutiny, and that is increasingly important given the number of bills we have. And if you look at just this term, where we are now in terms of the Parliament, we still actually have quite a few pieces of legislation that still need a huge amount of work. There are some that are members' bills, like my own, that have not yet gone to a committee. There's an awful lot of work, and the concept of post-leg scrutiny I think we need to reflect on. I think there's also been some really useful comments about the importance of carrying out inquiries. Again, I think that's a really important part of committees' work, which is not just shadowing what ministers do, but it's actually, as a committee, deciding over the next few years what are really important issues that need to be discussed and what recommendations need to be made. I think the comments about cross-cutting committees or committees that are doing parallel work. You've got a good example at the moment of the work on Grangemouth and Project Willow, where both the Net Zero Committee and the Economy Committee are taking evidence. So there are topics that cross over the basic subjects of committees, and I think there's, for me, post-legislative scrutiny, I think we could do more of and better off. I also think we could do more joined up cross-government or cross-policy thinking, and I think that's hard for the committees because they're so busy. So there's a huge amount of work in here, and also the nature of the job has changed, as a couple of people have said, in terms of the digital capacity of MSPs, but also our constituents. The way you can communicate with people, a huge amount has changed. So I think we need to reflect on how our committees could be better. So I think the timing of this piece of work by the SPPA committee is really, really important. And for me, a lot of this comes down to capacity of committees and leadership of committees and how we learn the lessons. Because things have changed a lot over the 25 years and we've got lessons we can learn. I think the key points that have been talked about, structure of committees, elected conveners, size of committees and kind of responsibilities of committees. Could we have short-term committees? Could we have particularly committees set up to deal with a piece of legislation? I mean, that could happen if a committee that should be dealing with it is actually just too busy. We have lots of challenges as you go into year 5 of this Parliament. I think in relation to the size of committees, some good comments about there's a role for smaller committees, but one of the things that occurred to me is that you don't need to actually have that as a requirement for all committees, because you've got a lot more government ministers than we've ever had, but you also do have members of the Parliament who are not on committees. There's some of us are subs in committees, we're not actually members. So there is an issue about capacity that I think we should think about. I very strongly want to support the points that have been made about we need to make sure there's a good gender balance on committees. I say that as a former planner. You need to have women involved in every policy area of life. And it's not just the committee members that are going to deliver that. There's also really important work that's done by groups like the Women's Budget Group. But we need both a balanced Parliament in terms of women, but Richard Leonard's comments about diversity on committees and other people have talked about urban and rural support in committees, but also just different professional backgrounds as well. I think we need to try and draw on that. I think there was a lot of good comments made about the need for elected committee conveners. I think the time has come for that. I have been on committees that were both critical of the government and I've been a government minister being massively criticised. So I think there's something about that status of conveners. And given that the last report on this was 2017, Presiding Officer, I think now is the time for change. Learn the lessons, let's get on with it. Let's strengthen the accountability of our Parliament, make it work better and make it deliver for the people. That's why we were set up in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call on Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And as I'm closing for the Scottish Conservatives, I want to pick up on a number of the points made in today's debate. But I want to also start by saying this debate has also brought self-reflection and navel-gazing to a whole new level. MSPs sitting for a couple of hours speaking about how good or otherwise they are on committees. But I say that by also adding that I've enjoyed it. I think it's been very valuable. And both Jackson Carlaw and Faisal Chowdhury mentioned that we do have a unicameral chamber. But we were also promised a committee system that would meet any deficiencies of having a unicameral chamber. And I'm not convinced we have done that yet. Rona Mackay mentioned that the committee should be the engine room of our Parliament, and Finlay Carson said they were the cornerstone of our democracy, and I absolutely agree with that. But if they are not performing to their optimum, they will not meet those aspirations that we had when this Parliament was reconvened in 1999 and since then. Martin Whitfield started us off today speaking about this being a listening exercise. And I have to say, when I was told I was speaking this debate, I quickly went to find the committee report. But it's obviously not been published yet. It's not been written. I think this might be a way of doing things, to actually have this chamber debate, to hear the varied views that we've had, and then the committee to come to a conclusion. Kenny Gibson spoke about his own committee, the Finance and Public Administration Committee, and I think that is a committee that has rightly been lauded by members across the Parliament, not just for Kenny Gibson's convenership, but the work of every single single member within it. And I certainly have two members of his committee, John Mason and Ross Greer, on my Education Committee, which I convene. They are two substantial committees, but they are also members who put a lot of work into the Finance Committee, but also the other committees they sit on. Richard Leonard for the Public Audit Committee, I thought, made a good point that they hear less from ministers and more from accountable officers. And while I like having ministers in front of my own committee, we have also had very successful sessions where accountable officers within their own sphere have come. For example, we had the SQA in front of us, we had the Chief Executive and the Chair of the SQA. When we recalled the Chief Executive, she resigned a few days before appearing again. I'm sure that wasn't in any way linked, but I think it is useful to sometimes get these outside bodies in front of us. I thought Audrey Nicholl made an excellent speech on behalf of her Justice Committee and rightly spoke about this relationship that they are building and the dialogue they are creating with stakeholders who are so important to the legislation that we are passing. And I think she spoke for every convener and every committee member when she praised the work of the clerks, but not just them, Spice, Pact and the media teams, which I certainly agree with. Rhoda Grant, I intervened on Rhoda Grant. I thought she gave an excellent response to my question. But while I hear the calls for single-sex committees, I do think there are some dangers. And I put again the point I would make. The Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee is convened by a Labour MSP, and apart from the convener, all of the members are female. So if this was in place at the moment, the committee who is leading this debate would restrict the Scottish Labour Party to only selecting a male convener, because it would then be single-sex if they put forward a female convener. And I will give way to Rhoda Grant.
Rhoda Grant.
Just on that point, there are many committees that there is only one woman on them, and there are some where there are no women on them. So that's an issue that happens right here, right now, and it's not good.
Douglas Ross.
I agree with that. What I'm trying to say is there are challenges with what the committee and perhaps Parliament will decide. Lorna Slater spoke about post-legislative scrutiny, and I think we all agree there has been a lack of that and we need to get better at that. Emma Roddick spoke about committee appearances should not be easy or enjoyable for ministers, and I agree with that. I'm not sure if she's speaking from her own experience as a former minister, but I think it is important that ministers are held to account on these issues. Stephen Kerr spoke about the workload balance. This is certainly an issue when there is so much legislation coming in at this part of the session, and Ash Regan made a number of points, but particularly about the impact on smaller parties or independent members, which is something maybe Parliament will have to look at into the next session. Now, I'm not speaking today as the convener of the Education Committee. I'm sure some of my colleagues will be delighted about that, but I do want to speak about some of the experiences I've taken from that committee. I'm not going to lie to this Parliament and say I am a non-partisan convener. I am extremely partisan. I accept that. I think at times that is important. I think when we have ministers in front of us, we are clearly going to ask party political questions, and I don't think we should be trying to deter members from doing that. I also think it is important in committee sessions for ministers to be held to account, because often in the chamber, and I've maybe shown this myself, I'm sometimes unhappy about not getting a direct answer from a minister. It is far harder for ministers to avoid the questions and the subjects when members can come back at them in committee. I know I don't have much time, Presiding Officer, but I want to finish with a point. My Scottish Conservative colleagues have outlined a number of our submissions to the committee. One that's not been talked about today, but I am particularly keen on, is for committee witnesses to declare any relevant interests. And I made this point to the committee. Scotland is a small country, and many of the people, I said, are almost professional witnesses. They come into Parliament time after time to give their view, which is important, but a lot of them are supported by the Scottish Government. And when they're giving that evidence, I think for balance, because MSPs would have to declare any financial interests, those committee witnesses should declare where their funding comes from. I think that would help our scrutiny and our deliberations going forward, and I look forward to continuing this debate with the committee. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And I call on the Minister up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, President Officer. And as others have, I've enjoyed this debate as well. Just like Emma Roddick, I didn't need to be bullied to take part, although I do think I was required. And I say to Jackson Carlo, I appreciate his memory doesn't go back to 1774, although I would suggest that, rather uncharitably suggest the person who cited it, their memory might go back to 1774. I don't think Mr Whitfield does, so he's not going to be able to duck my challenge. I look forward to a historical reference when we come to debate his committee's report in due course. This has been a useful means for us to reflect on how committees undertake their business over the 26
years of the Parliament's existence. There's much I could say, drawing on my 18 years of experience as a parliamentarian, but I will remind everyone I'm here to speak on behalf of the Government and will do so in responding to this debate. I would have first observed, though, and I think it picks up on the point that Douglas Ross has just made, the very nature of this debate shows that we are well capable of being flexible and being able to adapt the manner in which we work for a specific purpose. So, again, it's an example that our processes don't need to be replicated in every single circumstance. There are circumstances such as this inquiry where we can operate slightly differently. I want to talk about the purpose of committees in terms of the context of Parliament's structure. We are, of course, as has been remarked upon, a unicameral entity. I should say, returning again to Mr Carlaw's contribution, I enjoyed his selective rundown of unicameral institutions. He, of course, neglect to mention that Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland and Iceland also have single-chamber legislatures. But I do recognise in such circumstances it is important that we have a strong committee system. As someone who stands here to be held to account by Parliament, I think it is enormously important that we have strong committees. And indeed, Mr Leonard made the point that people are not elected to be robots. I've never thought of him as someone who is in robotic or an automaton. And I should say I thought Mr Mason was rather uncharitable in his assessment of the Public Audit Committee. As a former member of the Public Audit Committee, I can testify to the delight at which I felt when I was tapped on the shoulder to be asked to sit on the Public Audit Committee. And indeed, Mr Gibson was rightly cited as a very effective convener of the Finance and Public Administration Committee, and I can also testify to that, having been a former member of the Finance Committee under his convenership. I would say it was suggested that Emma Roddick, I might be slightly misquoting her, that ministers should be terrified to go to committees. I'm not quite sure that the basis of terror is necessarily going to be most conducive to some form of exchange. But I do recognise that it should be rightly a robust exchange and ministers held to account for the work that we undertake. Yes, of course.
Keith Brown.
Thank the Minister for taking the intervention. This afternoon, a number of people have mentioned the issue of government's backbenchers and the role of party discipline. There has been virtually no mention of the equally negative effect of opposition members who don't look at the merits of the legislation but simply try to propose opposition and tear down what's there. That is equally destructive of proper legislation. And until we get a balance in relation to that, recognising both sides of that, does the Minister agree it's unlikely we'll make much progress on that?
Minister.
We should not pretend. I think, again, I don't often agree with Mr Ross as much as this in any debate. We need to be realistic and reflect on the fact we are all elected here on a party political ticket, and with that comes party politics. But yes, I do think if we're going to reflect on the conduct of those members who are from the government party in the backbenches, then we should also reasonably reflect on the conduct of all members, irrespective of their party and the fashion in which they approach legislation before this chamber. Let me comment. I think I've got very little time to give when I've barely addressed much of the...
You have just over 1 minute, Minister.
I have over 1 minute. Otherwise, I would, of course, given way to Mr Kerr. In terms of some of the issues that have been raised, the issue of churn, turnover, call it what you will, I agree that that should be minimised as much as possible, but we should, of course, recognise there are various factors that lead to that in terms of, and it's not just appointment to ministerial office, there is illness, bereavement, there is also, I should say, some merit, and some members might want a breadth of experience, being able to sit on more than one committee in any given session. But I broadly agree with the principle. In terms of the size of committees, the Government has no strong view. It is instructed to hear those who sit in smaller committees to hear that that is something that could be felt to be useful. On the issue of elected conveners, the Scottish Government again has no
view. Not all I can say, and I made this point to the committee, and I make it again, in terms of the manner in which the government would interact with conveners. I return to Mr Ross again. By chance, I happened to meet him earlier today. If he'd been elected by the entire chamber rather than just by the committee, having been appointed to the committee as conveners are at this moment in time, it wouldn't have changed the nature of my interaction with him as a minister. So, in that sense, the government doesn't have a strong view. There is much more that I could say on this, Presiding Officer. I don't have the time, but doubtless we will return to the subject matter in due course, and I look forward to doing so.
Thank you, Minister. And I call on Martin Whitfield to wind up the debate.
I'm very grateful, Presiding Officer, and it has been a fascinating debate. And I would like to first of all thank everyone for their contributions, be it as role of convener and party representative, but also, more importantly, backbencher. But I will give a shout out to my fellow committee members for whom I thank their contributions, and I will take away with me the reminder about bacon rolls. I do want to put on the record my thanks also to my deputy convener, Ruth Maguire, who hasn't been able to be with us for a while, but I also thank her for her enormous work in relation to things around this, because I think it's not until you sit on a committee you realise how hard a committee can be. And we've heard a lot of discussion this afternoon about the workload. Members who sit on not just one, two, but many who sit on 3 committees. And we've also heard the counterbalance to that of the expectation of developing independence, knowledge and interest in the subject matters. And that, as a just politique real, is a very difficult thing to do for some members. I think the interesting discussion about whether the support of Spice questions actually has run the entire gambit of where it lies. There is something about us recalling as MSPs that we are independent. We should exist in committees where questions that are pertinent to the inquiry, pertinent to the legislation in front of us, can be asked and can be explored. So I think with so much, there isn't a single answer to this. There is an answer that through the convener, through the membership, through the interaction, can create a cultural environment in where we can have committees that can properly hold government to account. It may be through fear, it may be through interaction and consideration. There are, if it is very quick, Mr. Kerr.
Stephen Kerr.
I hope the convener has not lost the point that Douglas Ross made about the nature of declarations of interest by groups that appear before committees. They should declare public funding and what proportion of their total income is from public funds.
Martin Whitfield.
Every intervention teaches those who take it whether it's the appropriate time to have done it. I note that intervention is on the record. We have had a discussion about churn, which is similarly important. We've noted from the evidence, and has been reiterated today, that actually a period of time on a committee allows an expertise to be gathered, and that is also important. I am very conscious that time is short today, and that's also been raised in a number of contributions. The amount of time that committees have, how they sit, when they sit, how they pursue inquiries is also something that we are very, very much looking at and will form part of the report, because this has been genuinely a listening exercise by the committee to take on board parts of the evidence that we've not been able to capture, that interesting interaction between convener contribution and individual contribution, that from contribution from members who sit on more than one committee. And there are a number of areas that we will take forward and look at, and may indeed inquire to obtain further evidence on. This is very important. This Parliament needs to be iterative. It didn't look like this other than physically when it began in 1999. It can't look like this going forward. We are the session that was born in COVID. The next session will hopefully, I deeply pray, will not have the challenges that we had at the start. We need to create an institution which sees itself looking forward rather than back. Grasp the good ideas, be they from New Zealand or indeed other legislations, but also the ideas that are generated within that place. We are moving to the point where we will make considerations for our inquiry report, which we hope to publish and lay before this chamber before the October recess, when I am sure we can return again to the considerations of how to improve it. I'm grateful, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Whitfield. That concludes the debate on behalf of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee on Committee Effectiveness Inquiry. It's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of Parliamentary Bureau Motion 17661 on committee meeting times. And I ask Jamie Hepburn, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. The question on this motion will be put at decision time, and there's one question to be put as a result of today's business. The question is that motion 17661, in the name of Jamie Hepburn, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on committee meeting times, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. That concludes decision time, and I close this meeting.